Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually, a series with me, Mark Vernon, on intuition and the eye of the soul. If you like the series, please do share the films and be in touch via comments. I'd be very glad to hear what you make of them. I wanted to think in this episode about interiority, about inner life. The reason for that is that I think we have got to a point where we became very suspicious of inner life. And interiority, as if it's the kind of white noise of our minds, as if it's just the sort of background distortions of our fancies and strange thoughts, and has no sort of basis in reality, can't itself be a kind of source of knowledge and perception. And that's got to change, and in fact is changing. We need to learn to trust our inner lives and our interiority once more. So I wanted to think about that for a few minutes and why that might be important and where that might begin to lead us in terms of developing this spiritual sense, this spiritual perception. It became very deeply embedded in the mid-20th century with the movement in psychology called behaviourism. And this very explicitly took the decision to sort of write out inner life, to pretend that it doesn't really exist, that we're black boxes. And what matters is our behaviour and our behaviour alone. That if you can change someone's behaviour, then that's all that you need to do. Mice running through mazes, thinking about people as robots, all that side of things is part of the product of behaviourism. But of course, we're not like that. We're actually reflexive creatures, and we have an inner life with volition, with conscience, with values. And so behaviourism, really only took us so far, although it still shapes a lot of psychology today, particularly in the medical world. But we can begin to get a sense again, I think, that our inner lives are not delusions, not just delusions at least. We clearly do make mistakes sometimes. We clearly do get things wrong a lot of the time. But it's also possible to develop discernment so that we can gain a sense of when we've got it wrong and gain a sense of what's actually true in what we're perceiving and what's going on in our inner lives. That's the movement away from behaviourism and into something much more akin to psychotherapy, which is what I do a lot of my time working in psychotherapy, where we trust inner life. And it's actually a very important first step often in psychotherapy, to begin to trust, these little feelings, these little perceptions, perhaps trust dreams, trust intuitions, trust images that come into your mind. It's not straightforward. It often takes a lot of teasing out to work out really what they mean. But these things are not just, as it were, to be excluded, not just to be cut off, as if there's an ideal version of me that doesn't feel these complicated things, that doesn't get confused at times, but at the same time does have an image, an intuition, a sense of things. To begin to work with that, to work with inner life, is a really important first step often in psychotherapy. And once people kind of get into that zone, often things then, they certainly move into a different dimension. They certainly take off. It's quite common, I think, in psychotherapy for people to have had some sort of behavioural help at some time, perhaps some CBT. And, it's been some use, a few techniques on how to manage yourself when you're feeling stressed or anxious. There's no doubt that can be of use. But it leaves people feeling there's somehow more. There's something to their inner life that they want to understand and not just try and solve. That's the kind of thing which, when it comes to spirituality, I think is really very important indeed, getting that sense of deeper perception. Now, the reason for this is worth reflecting on. I think it's broadly because our inner lives are a kind of mirror or echo of the inner life of the world around us. That we're not just isolated feeling and thinking units encased inside our skull, but actually that our inner life resonates or harmonizes with the inner life of the world around us. That's quite a big ask to really trust that and believe that these days, because the official sort of position, scientific materialism, is very suspicious of the sense that there's a kind of inner life or vitality outside of our own brains. In fact, some people would go so far as to say that consciousness, our inner life, is itself a kind of delusion. That view is lessening, I think. It's not so powerful and dominant as it has been, but nonetheless it still can be around, and I think has the effect of making people feel nervous about trusting their own inner life, that it might in some way resonate with the inner life of all things around us, even the inner life of others, that I can know that when I'm loving my partner, they're loving me, that when we're looking at a sunset, we're sharing the same experience, and not just, as it were, behaving like cameras in splendid isolation, that there's something that's flowing through us all and it's shared. That's part of inner life. We've always wanted that kind of inner life, I think, that collective sense. It's in the modern world, it's why groups are so very appealing, be they the group that forms to watch a concert or to go to a sports event, the group that forms when nations celebrate weddings, when they celebrate national festivals and days. That collective sense lifts people, it's joyous, and it's because we are sharing this thing together. We're not just monads. We realise after all that my inner life is connected to your inner life. This is the beginnings of a spiritual sense returning. That's just self-evidently the case, it seems to me. It's not just pure delusion. It's something which actually is really important and grounds us in life. So that's another side to the way that we experience inner life, I think, and need to really embrace these experiences and not think they're just kind of optional extras, but that they can become part of a deepening spiritual sense of things. Now, it is interesting, though, to think about why the individual matters in this, how that came about. And in the evolution of consciousness, this idea that the human perception of things actually changes and evolves over time. Cyclically, I think, there's kind of periods of deepening and then periods of alienation and withdrawal as well. But in that cycle, inner life actually itself changes, it deepens, and then there's a sense of reconnection with a renewed sense of inner life. Let me be a bit more explicit. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, there's a very powerful injunction which you can read about in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. It's the injunction against idolatry. And this is smashing idols, which were thought to represent the inner life of other gods or the inner life of the sacred grove. And the ancient Hebrews went through a period where this became a really important part of what it was to be a Hebrew, part of what it was to be Jewish, to destroy the idols. It's thought, modern biblical scholarship suggests that it became very important in about 500 BC. This was a very extraordinary thing to suggest to do, because setting up a sacred pillar or having an image to remind you of the inner life of the grove, or to remind you of the inner life of the mountain, to remind you of the presence of the god, was something which was very natural for people to have done probably for countless millennia prior to this point. So it's worth asking, why did the Hebrews suddenly get this idea that idolatry was such a bad idea? And I think that what it's about is the development of inner life. It's a kind of spiritual practice that cuts people off from the inner life of everything else for a period, for a time, in order that they then have to fall back on their own inner life and develop that. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the enforcement of the idea of idolatry comes at about the same time that people start to write down spiritual texts. When you think about it, writing is a very, very different process of engagement, of participation from say, going for a walk in a forest or experiencing nature around you. Writing is about you and the text. You have, as it were, to reach into the text, to wrestle with its meaning, to bring the words back to life. If you pick up a text, that might have lain on the desk for years or decades, and then you read it, these words suddenly spring back to life. There's an engagement between you and the writing. This is very, very different from an oral culture, which preceded written cultures, and certainly was dominant before the ban on idols. Because an oral culture, things are remembered collectively. You participate in sharing them together. You learn it by heart, as it were. It emerges from within you. Writing does something very different, and in fact, studies of ancient religion have shown that not only does writing change the relationship of the individual to religious practices, the sense of a kind of personal spirituality, private devotion, developing yourself in relation to the religion really starts to take off at this time. But it also, very interestingly, deepens the sense of transcendence. What seems to have happened, certainly amongst the ancient Hebrews, is that they developed a much keener sense of their own self, their I amness, if you like, their I consciousness, the sort of depths that they felt within themselves, because they weren't always turning to the depths of the world around them. And in that depth could begin to emerge, could begin to be mirrored, a sense of the transcendence of the world itself, that there wasn't just the spirits in the woods, there wasn't just the gods in the sky, but perhaps there was a God who transcended it all. It's the beginnings of monotheism. And the famous revelation of this given to Moses in the Hebrew Bible is Moses standing before the burning bush and hearing God say, "I am." When you think about it, you need to have quite a powerful sense of your own I amness in order to understand what that might even mean, to begin to appreciate that it's significant. God's I amness, the transcendent monotheistic God that really starts to be perceived at this time, needs an individual I amness in order to be really received and understood. So idolatry, paradoxically, was a very important stage, I think, in the development of spirituality, because it was about developing inner life and interiority. And with that sense of your own inner life and interiority, your own I amness, the transcendent God can, as it were, show itself. You can get a very powerful sense of God that's not just in all things, the pantheistic view, but a deity that transcends all things, that holds all things in being, the panentheistic view, as it's sometimes put. And this was a key moment in the development of spirituality, our own interiority, mirroring the interiority, not just the world around us, but also of the transcendence of all things as well in God. It's still preserved very powerfully in Judaism, and in particular in Islam. You'll know that in Islam there aren't images of the natural world, there aren't images of people, but what there is a tremendous interest and emphasis on writing, on calligraphy. And if you've ever looked at a bit of calligraphy and just allowed it to have an impact upon you, even if you're not quite sure what it's saying, it very spontaneously stirs up a sense of inner life. It stirs up a wonder, an engagement of you with this text and what it's trying to say. It causes you to reach out from within yourself, and maybe even get a sense of the transcendence of all things, which is more abstract, which in a way is beyond the idols, beyond any naturalistic images, which I think is why idolatry is still deeply enforced. It's not a ban in a negative sense. I think it's actually a spiritual practice that can cultivate inner life, and maybe is really important to us now, having come through this behavioural phase where inner life was sort of denied or not allowed in behaviourism. Beginning to trust once more the images, the impulses, the intuitions which we have that aren't just our own but are shared with others. Interiority then, trusting interiority, going with it, learning to discern it, not just assuming it's all delusion and you're being fooled once more, is a key part in developing a spiritual sense and learning once more how to see spiritually.